Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Vegetation recovery research in deglaciated terrain is one of the quieter corners of botanical science, which suits the people who end up doing it. You spend a lot of time on your knees in recently exposed ground, cataloging the pioneer species that show up first after the ice pulls back. The mosses and lichens and small herbaceous plants that colonize bare rock and begin the slow process of building enough soil for larger things to follow. It's incremental work with a long timescale and a patience requirement that filters out everyone who needs their science to produce dramatic results quickly. I had been doing it for 8 years by the summer I'm describing, and I was good at it in the methodical, unglamorous way that the work rewarded. The program was based out of a research station in northern Canada, a climate monitoring initiative tracking vegetation responses to the accelerating glacial retreat that had been reshaping the landscape for decades. My assignment for the summer was a section of newly exposed terrain at the retreating edge of a glacier whose withdrawal over the previous decade had uncovered several square kilometers of ground that had been under ice for an indeterminate period. My job was to survey the vegetation recovery on the exposed ground, document which species were establishing and at what density, and add the data to the long-term recovery dataset the program had been building. I had done this work at 4 previous sites and knew what to expect. Bare rock at the ice edge, gradually transitioning to sparse lichen cover as you moved away from the glacier into terrain that had been exposed for longer than the early pioneer plant communities that preceded anything resembling a developed vegetation structure. The timeline of recovery was slow, decades for significant soil development, longer for anything approaching a closed plant community, and the work was essentially a documentation of absence, gradually becoming presence, a landscape remembering how to support life. The forest was at the ice edge. I want to be precise about that because the location mattered as much as the forest itself, not in terrain that had been exposed for years, not in ground that had been ice-free long enough for the recovery process to have run for any significant time. At the edge, emerging directly from under the retreating glacier, as if the ice was pulling back to reveal something it had been covering, rather than leaving behind bare ground for life to slowly reclaim. The trees were upright. That was the first impossibility, though I didn't process it as impossibility immediately because the visual of a forest appearing at the edge of a glacier was so far outside my framework for what deglaciated terrain looked like that my brain spent the first few minutes trying to fit it into something it could accommodate. Trees that had been overridden by a glacier didn't emerge upright. The weight and movement of glacial ice destroyed vegetation with a thoroughness that left nothing vertical. These were standing, their canopy intact, their root systems presumably in the ground below them, rather than crushed and scattered by glacial advance. I stood at the forest's edge for a long time before I went back to camp and got Tave. Tav was my research partner for the season, a botanist with a background in forest ecology that made her the right person to be standing beside me looking at what I had found. She was precise and thorough and deeply skeptical of findings that didn't have clear explanations, which was exactly the quality I needed in someone who was going to look at this forest and help me understand what I was looking at. She looked at it for a while, and then she walked into the edge of it and put her hand on the nearest tree trunk and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, in the way she did when she was taking in tactile information that her visual assessment hadn't resolved. She said the bark was warm, not room temperature warm, not the warmth of a surface that had been in sunlight, though the forest canopy above us filtered the light enough that direct sun wasn't explaining anything. The warmth of a living tree with active metabolic processes generating and retaining heat, which was what tree bark felt like in a temperate summer forest, but which had no business being what this bark felt like at the edge of a retreating glacier in northern Canada. We sampled carefully over the following days, taking the full range of measurements and specimens that a thorough botanical survey required, and everything the sampling produced was more impossible than the previous thing. Growth rings that didn't follow the annual pattern that temperate trees used, the concentric record of seasonal growth that dendrochronology relied on. These rings were there, but they weren't annual in their spacing or their character, as if the tree had been growing on a different schedule than the seasons around it. Root systems that went deeper than the exposed ground should have allowed, given how recently it had been under ice. The roots extending into substrate that the glacial history of the site said should be frozen and compacted and inhospitable. Active metabolic products in the tissue samples, chlorophyll, and the chemical products of photosynthesis in concentrations that living, actively growing trees produced. The trees were alive, not dormant, not in any suspended state that cold tolerance or ice encapsulation could account for. Alive in the full metabolic sense, growing, processing light, moving water through their vascular systems, doing everything that living trees did in conditions that living trees couldn't survive. Tave ran the carbon analysis on the wood samples at the end of the first week. She came back to camp that evening and sat down across from me and said she needed to tell me something about the age estimates before she put them in any report, because the numbers were going to require more verification than our field equipment could provide before she was willing to commit to them officially. I asked her what the numbers were. She said the carbon signatures in the wood were consistent with trees that had been alive for a period. She wasn't going to state as a number yet, because the number was not a number that trees were supposed to produce. I said I understood and asked her for a range. She gave me a range and I sat with it for a while. The lower end of the range was already beyond what the species we were looking at could biologically achieve under any known conditions. The upper end was a number I didn't have a ready framework for in the context of individual living organisms. I started noticing the changes in the second week. The survey work required me to spend extended periods in the forest, moving through it with instruments and sample kits and the particular close attention of someone trying to understand a biological system from the inside. I had spent enough time in forests to have a baseline for how they felt to work in the passive relationship between a researcher and the vegetation community they were studying, the forest doing what forest did without reference to the person walking through it. This forest wasn't doing that. The changes were small and individually explicable. temperature readings inside the forest canopy that varied in ways that microclimatic models couldn't fully account for, humidity gradients that didn't follow the patterns that forest structure produced, the canopy movement in wind conditions that should have produced consistent behavior producing inconsistent behavior, sections of canopy responding differently to the same wind event in ways that tree physiology couldn't explain. Each individual observation had an explanation available if you looked for one hard enough. Together, they formed a pattern that I spent several evenings writing up in my field notes, and that resolved, by the end of the second week, into a conclusion I kept drafting and redrafting because I didn't have language for it that fit inside a scientific document. The forest was responding to our presence, not through any mechanism I could identify, not through any process in my botanical training that covered this situation, but the measurable environmental parameters inside the forest changed in the hours following our arrival each morning and returned to their baseline values after we left each evening, with a consistency across the 2 weeks of data that I couldn't attribute to coincidence and couldn't attribute to anything else with the tools I had available. Something in the biological system of those trees was registering that we were there and doing something with that information. Tave didn't come out of the forest on a Thursday. I was at the camp at the forest's edge doing data entry when the time came and passed and she didn't appear. I gave it 20 minutes before I went in looking for her, following the survey route she had been working that day, and I found her about 10 minutes inside the tree line. She was standing with her back to me, her survey equipment on the ground at her feet, both hands flat against the bark of the largest tree we had found in the forest, a specimen whose diameter was large enough that 2 people couldn't have joined hands around it. She was standing still in the way that people stand still when they are doing something with their full attention, and she didn't respond when I said her name from 10 feet away. I said it again, closer, and put my hand on her shoulder, and she turned around. The expression on her face was one I recognized from the kind of deep concentration that fieldwork sometimes produced, the look of someone who has been somewhere else in their attention and is coming back. But it was also something underneath that, something that the concentration expression was sitting on top of, and what was underneath it was the expression of someone who had received something, a piece of information or an experience that was still being processed and might take a long time to finish processing. She looked at me and said she was fine and picked up her equipment, and we walked out of the forest together, and she didn't say anything else until we were back at camp and had been sitting for about 10 minutes. She said the tree was very old. I said I knew. She said she didn't mean the carbon dating. She said she meant that she had felt how old it was when she was touching it, which was not the kind of thing Tave said, ever. In 8 years of working alongside her in various field contexts, she said it matter-of-factly and with the slight distance of someone reporting rather than interpreting. And then she got up and started cooking dinner, and we didn't talk about it again that evening. I filed the interim report to the program at the end of the second week, characterizing the forest as an extraordinary botanical discovery with anomalous biological characteristics requiring specialized analysis beyond our field capacity. I recommended restricted access pending a formal assessment by a team with appropriate expertise and equipment, which was the professional language For we have found something we don't know how to study, and we need help before anyone else goes in there. The program's response came faster than interim reports usually produced responses, routed through the funding agency rather than the normal program administration channel, and the access restriction I had recommended was implemented within days. Tave and I were asked to complete our documentation and prepare to hand the site off to a specialist team whose composition we weren't given details about. I left the field a week before the season's end date, which I characterized to the program as a personal matter, and which was true enough in the sense that what I needed to process wasn't going to be processed productively in a camp at the edge of a forest that I was no longer supposed to enter. The forest is still there. The glacier is still retreating. Whatever portion of it remains under the ice is still under the ice, alive in the way it has been alive through however many thousands of years of glacial advance and retreat the landscape's history has included. I think about what the ice was doing to it all that time. Not killing it, not preserving it in the way that cold preserves things, suspending them in the state they were in when the cold arrived. Something else, something I don't have a botanical category for, something that produced the growth rings that didn't follow seasons and the roots that went deeper than they should, and the metabolic activity that shouldn't have been possible in a frozen substrate. Whatever the ice was doing to the forest, it wasn't stopping it. It was changing it into something that knew we were there, into something that Tave stood with her hands against for an hour and came back from with the look of a person who had been told something very old and very large and very patient. She never told me what it was. I never asked.